June 4, 1943. A train pulls into the small station of Mexia, Texas. Inside, 1,850 veterans of the elite Africa Corps, men who had once been the desert foxes of the Third Reich, press their faces against the glass. They are expecting to see a nation in ruins. They were told that New York was a pile of rubble and that Americans were starving, clinging to a decadent, collapsed democracy. Instead, they see a constellation. As far as the eye can see, the Texas plains are ablaze with electric light. Farmhouses, street corners, shop windows, every inch of the landscape is glowing at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, the lights had gone out 3 years ago. In the Reich, even before the war, barely 20% of farms had power. But here, in the heart of the enemy territory, electricity flows like water. Among the prisoners is Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt. He pulls out a hidden diary and writes a sentence that, if seen by his officers, would have earned him solitary confinement. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. This was the moment the war was truly won. Not on a battlefield in Tunisia or an island in the Pacific, but in the minds of 250,000 soldiers who realized, in a single night, that everything they believed was a lie. The journey to this realization began weeks earlier in North Africa. When General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered his forces in May 1943, nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners. Among them was Hermann Friedrich Rathke, a holder of the Iron Cross. He expected the brutality he had seen on the Eastern Front. Instead, he encountered American efficiency. At the port of Oran, the U.S. Army processed thousands of men daily. Identity cards, medical exams, and inoculations were handled with a precision that exceeded the Wehrmacht's highest standards. But the real psychological blow was the food. Oberstfighter Hans Meyer, a veteran of the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother that in the cage, at Oran, they ate better than they had in 6 months of combat. White bread, real coffee, and meat twice a day. The Germans assumed it was a trick, propaganda designed to break their will. They didn't realize they were simply eating standard American military rations. As the prisoners were herded onto Liberty ships for the Atlantic crossing, they were walking onto monuments of industrial impossible. They stood on the decks of ships like the SS Robert E. Peary. If the Germans had known the truth, they wouldn't have believed it. That specific ship had been built from the keel up in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. During the 2-week crossing, the psychological demolition intensified. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann watched in horror as American sailors threw away more food waste in a single day than his entire company had received in weekly rations in Africa. They threw away half-eaten steaks and whole loaves of bread, not to mock the Germans, but because the supply was so limitless that the waste meant nothing. On the bridge of the cargo ship, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern noticed a rotating radar antenna. He had been told that only the highest-tier German and British warships possessed such technology. Seeing it as standard equipment on a common cargo vessel led him to a terrifying conclusion. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. When the ships docked at Norfolk Naval Base in August 1943, the sheer scale of American power became undeniable. The base sprawled across 4,300 acres. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a former factory worker, counted 47 cargo ships being loaded simultaneously. He watched electric cranes move with a smoothness that didn't exist in the soot-choked industrial cities of the Ruhr. But as they marched to the trains, they saw something even more disturbing: parking lots. Thousands of civilian automobiles were parked outside the docks. In Germany, a car was a luxury for the Nazi elite. The people's car, the Volkswagen, had been a propaganda dream that was never delivered to the people. Yet here, ordinary dock workers drove themselves to work in their own vehicles. The prisoners were marched toward the tracks, expecting cattle cars or freight wagons, the 40 and 8 wagons that had transported them across Europe. Instead, they found Pullman coaches. Padded seats that converted to sleeping berths. Dining cars with white tablecloths. "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners," Rathke wrote. In one car, an American sergeant actually apologized because the air conditioning wasn't working perfectly. The Germans sat in stunned silence. In their world, such luxury was reserved for Hitler's personal train. As the trains rolled through the American heartland toward camps in Texas and Oklahoma, the great American lie continued to crumble. Every small town they passed, Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, was a blaze of light. They saw factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, their parking lots full even at midnight. Heinrich Miller, an electrical engineer before the war, sat in a railway yard in Roanoke, Virginia, and did the math. A single American railway yard used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. He called it the carelessness of infinite resource. Crossing into Tennessee, the scale of production reached a fever pitch. They passed the Alcoa aluminum plant, which stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Outside Louisville, they saw the Rubbertown complex. 4 massive synthetic rubber plants that had been built in just 18 months. These facilities produced 800,000 tons of rubber annually. Germany, the nation that had invented the process, had never managed more than 120,000. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, recognized the distillation columns as they passed. He knew the science. He knew that if there were dozens more of these plants across the country, as the guards claimed, the German war machine was a candle flickering in a hurricane. In Michigan, the train passed the Willow Run plant. A single factory, nearly a mile long, that produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. A Luftwaffe pilot, Hauptmann Wehrli, watched 17 bombers in various stages of completion through the window. He had been told American planes were inferior junk. Looking at the precision of the assembly lines, he realized the truth. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible. In St. Louis, the prisoners crossed the Mississippi and saw barges carrying more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son, watched a crane operator loading wheat while eating a sandwich with meat thicker than a German's weekly ration. In Kansas City, they passed the stockyards. Tens of thousands of cattle waiting for slaughter. Gefreiter Paul Fischer wrote that the Americans ate meat like Germans ate bread. His guard casually bought 20 hamburgers from a station stand for a single dollar bill. It wasn't a special occasion. It was Tuesday. The arrival at the camps provided the final level of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearne, Texas, was a city built in 4 months. It featured wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, and steam heat, conditions that exceeded what many of these men had known as civilians. The camp hospital at Hearne was better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a surgeon, found himself surrounded by X-ray machines and pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany for years. Most shocking was a drug called Penicillin. Bauer watched as the Americans used this miracle drug freely on prisoners for minor infections, while back home, German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs. The Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation, he testified. By late 1943, a labor shortage led to the prisoners working in American fields and factories. This was the turning point. Now, they weren't just seeing the abundance through a train window, they were touching it. In a Texas cotton gin, Herbert Lang watched a single machine do the work of an entire village. He learned about rural electrification, that 90% of Texas farms had power. The farmer who owned the gin wasn't a party official or an aristocrat, he was just a farmer. Yet he had a car, a truck, and a tractor. In Nebraska, Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann worked for a farmer whose 16-year-old son drove a tractor worth more than Hoffmann's father had earned in a lifetime. When Hoffmann mentioned the value, the boy just laughed. He said it was an old model. They were waiting for a better one from John Deere. At a Campbell Soup factory in New Jersey, Ernst Wagner saw production lines managed by a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as the young men were away at war. Yet, the automation was so advanced that production was higher than it had been in peacetime. He watched an elderly woman monitor a control panel while drinking coffee and listening to the radio, a task that would have required 50 workers in Germany. By the winter of 1943, American intelligence officers noticed a phenomenon they called ideological collapse syndrome. The most fanatical Nazis had become quiet. They no longer argued when shown production statistics. They had seen too much. Camp newspapers, like Der Ruf, began to shift. They stopped talking about national pride and started discussing democracy and post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz wrote, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak and divided. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." Even the treatment of former allies played a role. After Italy surrendered, Italian prisoners were given more freedom and better pay. German prisoners watched their former allies dating American women and eating in American restaurants. They realized that the democracy they were taught to despise was actually a system of incredible social mobility and forgiveness. The final blow to Nazi racial theory wasn't a factory, it was a gift. For Christmas 1943, American civic groups and churches sent 500,000 packages to German prisoners, the very men who had been trying to kill their sons only months before. Each package had cigarettes, candy, and games. In Hearne, A local church choir sang carols in German outside the barbed wire. Women from the town sent in homemade cookies. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, who had lost a brother in the bombing of Hamburg, was shaken. They know we are their enemies. Yet they show us Christian charity. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory. The Christmas feast itself, turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, and ice cream, was more food than many had seen since 1914. They ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend that such resources were being wasted on them. By 1944, over 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in education. They studied English, history, and science. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Professors from Stanford came to lecture. Hermann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He found that his professors included Jewish refugees who had fled Germany. They taught without hatred, speaking of science as a universal language. Von Braun realized the Americans were years ahead of German research, and they were sharing that knowledge with their captives. In the camp theaters, they watched Hollywood films. They saw Gone with the Wind, a story of defeat and recovery. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that a nation would show its own failures and poverty to its enemies. They hide nothing, wrote Joseph Kramer. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. As the war entered its final year, the prisoners watched the arsenal of democracy reach its peak. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they watched women and teenagers assemble 700 landing craft a month, more boats in 30 days than the entire German Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, they saw 10,000 tons of steel produced daily. Oberstleutnant Paul Hartmann, who had worked at the Krupp Works in Germany, was speechless. They wasted more steel and spillage than we could produce. This was beyond imagination. When news of the D-Day invasion reached the camps, the collapse was total. The Germans watched newsreels of 6,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. They saw their homeland being crushed not by a mongrel nation, but by the greatest industrial power in human history. Friedrich von Stauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost. Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, and courage against their unlimited resources." When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners faced repatriation. But they weren't the same men who had stepped off the train in 1943. They had been converted by prosperity. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 Germans were sent home. They returned to a country that was a graveyard of rubble. But they brought with them the blueprints for a new society. They knew how a democratic industrial nation functioned. Many of these former prisoners became the architects of the West German economic miracle. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became the West German ambassador to the U.S. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes in a camp, became the first president of the European Commission. They brought American efficiency to German industry and American democratic ideals to German politics. As Hans Kroll later wrote, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth." In 1985, 40 years after the war, over 500 former prisoners returned to Austin, Texas, for a reunion. They weren't there to celebrate a war, but to celebrate a transformation. Hans Weber, who had become a physician, spoke to the crowd. He talked about the running water and the abundant food, but mostly, he talked about the dignity. He recalled how farmers in Iowa had treated him not as a Nazi, but as a young man far from home. Hermann Goetz, then 78, delivered the final words. "We came to America as enemies, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes from production, not hatred. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy, and it changed us forever." The story of the German prisoners in America is a testament to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in the American arsenal wasn't the bomb or the tank. It was the simple, overwhelming evidence of what a free society can achieve. They arrived expecting to find a dying nation. They left as students of a future they would go on to build. And in that transformation, the Nazi dream didn't just die, it was replaced by something much more powerful, the reality of freedom. The story of the 371,000 is more than a footnote of World War II. It is the moment the greatest industrial machine ever built met the men who were told it didn't exist. If you want to know how the modern world was truly forged, look no further than the lights of a Texas farmhouse in 1943. If you found this exploration of the arsenal of democracy insightful, consider following for more deep dives into the hidden turning points of history. What other moments of the war do you think were won in the mind rather than the battlefield? Let us know in the comments below.